The grand ballroom of the city's luxury hotel shimmered like a jewel under the glow of crystal chandeliers. The air was thick with the scent of fresh flowers and expensive perfumes, mingling with the soft sounds of classical music that floated through the space, creating an atmosphere of elegance and sophistication. Guests, dressed in tuxedos and glamorous evening gowns, swirled glasses of champagne in hand, laughing and engaging in lively conversation. They had all gathered for the charity ball, generously sponsored by Alexander Grant, a name that carried weight far beyond the glittering wealth it implied. At the center of this lavish event stood Alexander himself, a tall, commanding figure who exuded confidence and charisma. His dark hair was impeccably styled, and his tailored suit fit him perfectly, the epitome of power and influence. His piercing blue eyes scanned the crowd, taking in the sea of faces that watched him with anticipation, waiting to hear what he had to say. Tonight, he was more than just a billionaire. He was a beacon of hope, a champion of important causes. As he approached the podium, the crowd fell into a respectful silence. Alexander cleared his throat, his voice ringing out with authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. Your presence is not just a testament to your generosity, but to your commitment to making a difference." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room, the gravity of his message almost tangible. Together, we can change lives, uplift communities, and create a brighter future for those less fortunate. Thunderous applause followed, echoing through the grand hall as Alexander spoke passionately about the projects funded by the charity. He touched on education, healthcare, and the vital importance of giving back to society. His words wove a tapestry of hope, igniting a fire in the hearts of his audience. Yet, amid the applause and admiration, an odd sensation crept over him, a feeling of being watched, as if someone's gaze was fixed on him with an intensity that stirred something deep within. As his speech came to a close, the applause crescendoed, filling the room with an almost electric energy. He smiled gracefully, acknowledging the crowd, and was about to step down when he noticed a small figure standing at the edge of the event. A boy, no more than 8 years old, with messy brown hair and wide, curious eyes. The child seemed out of place in the midst of the glamorous adults, but his innocent demeanor caught Alexander's attention, stirring something within him, a faint echo of a past he had nearly forgotten. As the crowd began to disperse, the boy took a tentative step forward, his gaze locked on Alexander. Tugging at the billionaire's sleeve with his small hand, he barely managed to grasp the fine fabric. "Hello, sir," the boy said, his voice high and clear, cutting through the lingering noise of the ball. "My dad has a birthmark, just like yours." For a fleeting moment, Alexander's smile faltered, his heart racing as his mind raced. Instinctively, his hand moved to his forearm, where a distinctive crescent-shaped birthmark had been since he was a child, a mark he rarely thought about, an insignia of his individuality. But now, in this moment, it seemed like a link to something far greater and more significant. Alexander knelt down to the boy's level, curiosity piqued. "Really?" he asked, his voice softening as the boy gestured animatedly, his hands tracing the shape of a crescent moon in the air. "I always thought it was cool. It makes us special, right?" Alexander's heart swelled at the boy's innocent enthusiasm. "Yes, it does make us special," he replied with a warm smile. "What's your name, little one?" "Oliver," the boy said proudly, clearly delighted to share his name. "I'm here with my dad. He said I could come see the important people." "You're an important person." Alexander chuckled, the sound breaking through the inexplicable tension that had settled in his chest. "I suppose you could say that," he said, his tone playful. "But you know, the most important people are the ones who care about others, just like you and your dad." Oliver nodded solemnly, his eyes shining with admiration. "I want to help people too, just like you," he said earnestly, his voice filled with a sincerity that struck Alexander deeply, reminding him of a time when he, too, had dreamed of making a difference. Alexander glanced up, his eyes searching the crowd, wondering who this child's father might be. The moment had taken an unexpected turn, and the words the boy had spoken seemed to awaken something within him, a stirring from the past that he couldn't quite place. The weight of wealth and responsibility often blurred the dreams Alexander once held. But in that fleeting moment with Oliver, everything else around him faded into the background. The festive noise of the grand ball became a distant hum, as Alexander felt an unexpected connection with the boy, a bond that transcended their differences in age and circumstances. It was as if Oliver had pulled back a curtain, offering Alexander a glimpse of a past long buried beneath layers of success and ambition. "Do you think you'll be a billionaire one day?" Oliver asked, his wide eyes sparkling with innocent curiosity. Alexander chuckled warmly, his heart softening at the boy's genuine wonder. "I don't know about that, but I do hope I can be someone who helps others, just like I'm trying to do tonight." "I can help you. I want to help," Oliver exclaimed, his enthusiasm infectious. Alexander's smile deepened, touched by the boy's earnestness. "You're already helping, Oliver," he replied sincerely, his voice filled with warmth. "Just by being here and caring, you're helping more than you know." But as quickly as that moment had arrived, it began to slip away. The sounds of the ball slowly returned, drawing Alexander's attention back to the present. He glanced around, realizing their time together was coming to an end. As he stood, he felt a strange mix of emotions stirring within him. Nostalgia, curiosity, and something deeper, something he couldn't quite place. "Be good, Oliver," Alexander said softly, ruffling the boy's hair with a gentle touch. "And don't forget to help your dad too." "I will," Oliver promised, a bright smile lighting up his face. "Maybe one day we can help people together." As the boy turned to rejoin his father, Alexander watched him go, his heart heavy with unspoken questions. Who was Oliver's father? What stories lay behind that birthmark they both shared? The night continued to unfold around Alexander, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was just the beginning of something much larger, an unexpected connection to a past he had long thought he'd left behind. With a deep sigh, Alexander returned to the ball, engaging once again with the guests, but his mind was elsewhere, wandering through a maze of memories and emotions. He couldn't have known then that the innocent words of a child would lead him down a path of discovery, one that would unravel the very fabric of his identity and reshape the legacy he thought he understood. As laughter and conversation swirled around him, the night became a tapestry of possibilities, the threads of his life subtly intertwining with those of the boy and his family, hinting at a future full of revelations and transformative connections. The murmurs of the ball receded into the background as Alexander drifted away from the crowd, his mind still reeling from the boy's innocent declaration. Laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses blended together as he navigated through the elegantly dressed guests. The grand ballroom, adorned with floral arrangements and glittering chandeliers, now felt stifling in its opulence. Oliver's words echoed in Alexander's mind, like a haunting melody that stirred something deep within, a memory long buried under layers of ambition and success. Determined to find answers, Alexander discreetly scanned the room for Oliver's father. He approached a group of guests drawn by their laughter, but they spoke quietly about the highlights of the evening, oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions growing inside him. Clearing his throat, he caught the attention of a woman with elegantly styled hair and a shimmering gown. "Excuse me," he began, his voice steady despite the anxiety simmering within him. "Do any of you know the boy who was here a moment ago? The one who mentioned a birthmark?" The woman tilted her head slightly, a faint frown crossing her brow. "Oh, you mean Oliver? I believe his father is around here somewhere. I suppose he's attending to some matters." "Matters?" Alexander repeated, his interest piqued. "Do you know his name?" "Daniel, if I'm not mistaken." "Daniel Carter," she replied, her tone softening. "He's a kind man. I've seen him at a few of these events, always with his son." Alexander nodded, the name reverberating in his mind. He felt a strange pull toward the boy and his father, as if invisible threads were weaving their lives together. Thanking the woman, he moved on, scanning the room for any sign of Daniel Carter. Each moment seemed to stretch as he was propelled by a mixture of curiosity and rising anxiety. After what felt like an eternity, Alexander spotted Daniel across the room, engaged in conversation with another guest. He was tall, with a rugged handsomeness that seemed to mirror Alexander's own features. It was as if he were looking into a mirror, one that reflected the shadows of a life not lived. Alexander felt an inexplicable connection, a thread of fate entwining their lives. Gathering his courage, Alexander approached Daniel, who was laughing at something his companion had said. As Alexander drew near, Daniel turned, his laughter fading as a flicker of recognition flashed in his eyes. "Mr. Grant," Daniel greeted him, extending his hand. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Daniel, right?" Alexander replied, shaking his hand. "I wanted to talk to you about your son, Oliver." Daniel's expression shifted slightly, curiosity replacing the easy laughter that had been there moments before. Alexander's mind raced, the unspoken questions swirling like a storm. Questions that had the potential to unravel a lifetime of assumptions and open the door to something profoundly personal, something he never could have anticipated. The expression on Daniel's face shifted to one of curiosity. "Oh, what about Oliver?" he asked, his tone cautious but intrigued. "There's something peculiar about our meeting tonight," Alexander began, his voice low and measured, careful not to attract the attention of the nearby guests. "He mentioned a birthmark we share, and I couldn't shake this overwhelming feeling, this need to know more." Daniel raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "A birthmark, huh?" He's always been fascinated by those kinds of connections. It's funny how children can notice things we adults tend to overlook. "Yes, that's true," Alexander responded, his heart racing as the conversation deepened. "I'd like to learn more about your family, if you don't mind." The two men slowly drifted away from the crowd, finding a quieter corner of the grand ballroom. Here, the music softened to a gentle hum, and the ambient light cast a warm, almost intimate glow around them. Daniel's expression grew pensive, his gaze momentarily distant, as though he were weighing the significance of Alexander's request. "Oliver and I live a simple life," Daniel said finally, his voice steady but guarded. "I'm a single father, working hard to provide for him. We don't have much, but we make do." Alexander nodded, sensing the deeper layers behind Daniel's words. "You're doing a remarkable job. He's an incredible boy." Daniel smiled, warmth flooding his eyes. "Thank you. He's my world." As they continued to talk, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were intertwined in ways he didn't yet understand. Oliver's bright eyes and innocent questions had stirred something within him, an old curiosity about his own family roots, a past he had carefully buried beneath the weight of his empire. "Tell me about your family," Alexander asked softly, his voice almost a whisper. "Do you have any siblings? Is there something about your past that I should know?" Daniel's eyes darkened slightly, a shadow of pain flickering across his features. "There's not much to tell," he said after a long pause. "I grew up in a small town, but I left after things got complicated. My parents passed away, and I lost contact with the few relatives I had." "What do you mean by complicated?" Alexander pressed gently, his interest growing. Daniel hesitated, the weight of unspoken truths hanging in the air between them. "There was a tragedy. My uncle died, and there were rumors about a child. Something that was never fully explained. It's not something I like to dwell on." Alexander's heart clenched as Daniel spoke. The mention of a child struck a deep chord within him, sending waves of unease through his mind. It was as if they were on the verge of a revelation, one that could change everything. "I understand," Alexander replied, his voice steady despite the inner turmoil. "But sometimes the past has a way of catching up with us." Daniel nodded, his expression softening. "Yes, and sometimes it's better to leave certain things buried." Their conversation hung in the air, laden with unspoken possibilities. As the music swelled around them, Alexander's mind raced, piecing together fragments of a family history he was only beginning to uncover. The birthmark, the tragedy, the distant rumors of a child. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle he was desperate to solve. Later that night, when Alexander returned to his luxurious penthouse, the echoes of the evening still lingered. The opulence of his surroundings now felt hollow, overshadowed by the questions that flooded his mind. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling like the thoughts racing through his head. Seated on the edge of his sleek sofa, he reached for an old photo album he had tucked away on a nearby shelf. Dust particles danced in the air as he opened it, revealing images from a time long past. Each photograph told a story, a glimpse into a life he had almost forgotten. His fingers traced over the pictures, pausing on a photo of himself as a young boy, a child with the same crescent-shaped birthmark that Oliver had mentioned. The resemblance was striking, the familiarity overwhelming. He closed his eyes as memories flooded back, laughter, warmth, and the pain of loss. He remembered family gatherings, the way his mother's eyes sparkled when she spoke of their ancestors, of the stories passed down through generations. But there had also been shadows, rumors of secrets hidden behind the facade of wealth and success. Alexander's thoughts spun wildly, and he felt an overwhelming urge to uncover the truth. There had to be more to this story, more to his connection with Oliver and Daniel. The idea of hiring a private investigator flickered in his mind like a beacon, lighting the way toward the answers he sought. Without hesitation, he picked up his phone, the screen casting a soft glow on his face in the dim room. He began searching for investigators in the area, looking for someone discreet, someone who could help him navigate the tangled web of his family's history. His heart raced with anticipation as he made the call, feeling the weight of his decision settle on his chest. As he hung up the phone, Alexander knew he was on the brink of a journey that would take him to places he had avoided for far too long. The shadows of the past were calling to him, and he was ready to answer. With a deep sigh, he braced himself for what was to come, knowing that the answers he sought could reshape his understanding of family, identity, and ultimately, of himself. In the days that followed, time seemed to slow for Alexander. Each hour weighed heavily, burdened by the gravity of Oliver's words and the unsettling wave of nostalgia they had stirred. He found himself lost in fragments of memories, echoes of his past swirling around him like shadows that refused to settle. The penthouse, with all its grandeur, felt increasingly empty. The bright city skyline outside his window seemed distant, a stark contrast to the vivid, though fragmented, recollections of his childhood that danced on the edges of his consciousness. Sitting in his study, Alexander gazed at the wall adorned with photographs chronicling his life. Each frame was a testament to his success, but none spoke to the hollow ache growing inside him. They were silent on the deeper, more elusive truths he now felt compelled to uncover. The memory flickered like an old photograph, faded from too much time in the sun. Alexander recalled a distant relative, a figure who had vanished from his life when he was far too young to fully grasp the weight of loss. The details were blurry, fragmented, like trying to catch smoke with his hands. He closed his eyes, allowing the flood of recollections to wash over him. He could almost imagine a family gathering in a cozy, sunlit living room, the laughter of relatives echoing in his ears. But in the corner of that memory, a shadow lingered, a kind older man with gentle eyes and a soft smile, always present but somehow distant, as if he had simply disappeared one day, leaving no trace behind. Alexander felt a pang of longing, a yearning for a connection he had never quite understood. "Why can't I remember more?" he murmured to himself, frustration coloring his voice. He needed answers, and the innocent proclamation of the child had ignited a fire deep within him, one that now refused to be extinguished. It was as if Oliver had unlocked a door to a past Alexander had long since shut away. The following day, he met with the private detective he had hired. The investigator was a lean man with sharp eyes and a focused demeanor, sitting across from him in a sleek, modern cafe. The place was alive with the hum of conversation, but to Alexander, it felt as though he were in a bubble of isolation, waiting for a revelation that could change everything. "Mr. Grant," the investigator began, scanning through his notes. "I looked into Oliver's father, Daniel. It seems he lived in the same town where you grew up." The word sent a chill down Alexander's spine, a coldness that felt like icy fingers trailing along his back. "What do you mean? What town?" he asked, his voice tight with anticipation. "Ciderwood," the investigator replied, looking up to meet Alexander's gaze. "It's a small town, not far from where you spent your childhood. Daniel moved away years ago, but records show he was born and raised there. Ciderwood, Alexander whispered, the name reverberating in his mind like a ghostly reminder of the past. He hadn't thought of that town in years, but the memories of sun-soaked days playing in the fields and family picnics flooded his mind, intertwined with an ever-present sense of loss that had never fully disappeared. The detective continued, his tone steady. The investigation also revealed some family ties between your family and Daniel's. There are indications of a connection that goes beyond simply living in the same town. Alexander leaned forward, his heart racing. What kind of connection? The investigator rifled through his papers, his brow furrowed in concentration. There's mention of a family tragedy involving a man named Henry Grant, your uncle, I believe. He had a son, but the circumstances surrounding his disappearance are murky. It's unclear what exactly happened, but it left a mark on your family. The mention of his uncle's name struck something deep within Alexander. Henry had always been a figure shrouded in mystery, a man spoken of in hushed tones during family gatherings. He had vanished around the same time Alexander had lost contact with that part of his family. Do you think Daniel might be related to him? Alexander asked, his mind racing with the possibilities. The investigator nodded. It's certainly possible. If Daniel is indeed connected to Henry, then Oliver could very well be your nephew. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, the words echoing in Alexander's mind. His heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and fear. A nephew? The thought was both unimaginable and exhilarating. He had spent so many years building a life that seemed detached from familial ties, and now the idea of a family connection, especially through a child, was both thrilling and terrifying. Thank you, Alexander whispered, his voice barely audible. He felt an inexplicable pull towards Ciderwood, a magnetic urge to return to the place that held the key to his past. I have to go there. I need to know more. The investigator nodded, sensing the urgency in Alexander's tone. I can assist with that. I'll gather more information and send you everything I find. As Alexander left the cafe, his mind swirled with thoughts of the small town that had once been his home. He could almost see the familiar streets, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, and the old family house that had witnessed countless memories. Would it still feel like home, or would it be a haunting reminder of all he had lost? The next day, Alexander embarked on his journey to Ciderwood, his heart a whirlwind of anticipation and apprehension. The landscape slowly shifted from the bustling city to the tranquil charm of the countryside, a place that had once defined his childhood. As he navigated the winding roads, a deep sense of nostalgia washed over him, mingling with the hope of uncovering the truth. Upon arriving in Ciderwood, he was struck by how little had changed. The town was a patchwork of memories, each corner holding a story, every building a fragment of his past. He parked in front of a dilapidated house that had once belonged to his family. The paint was peeling, and the garden, once vibrant with blooming flowers, had fallen into neglect. Yet, despite its worn appearance, the house seemed alive with whispers from the past, beckoning him to step inside. As he approached the front door, the memories came flooding back. He could almost hear the laughter of children playing in the yard and smell the comforting aroma of his mother's cooking wafting through the open windows. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open, the creak echoing through the empty halls like a ghostly greeting. The interior was dark, the air thick with dust, and the scent of forgotten memories. Sunlight filtered through the grime-covered windows, casting a golden glow on the faded wallpaper. Alexander wandered through the rooms, each step sending waves of nostalgia coursing through him. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. "You've come back, haven't you?" Startled, Alexander turned to find an elderly woman standing in the doorway, her eyes gleaming with recognition. She was frail and thin, but her presence radiated warmth, immediately putting him at ease. I used to live here," Alexander stammered, his heart pounding. "I'm Alexander Grant." The woman's eyes widened slightly, her face softening with a mixture of surprise and understanding. Her eyes widened, and a soft smile crinkled her weathered face. "I remember you, dear," she said, her voice gentle with nostalgia. You were just a boy when you left. Your mother used to bring you here every summer." "It's been years since I last came back," Alexander admitted, feeling the emotions swirling inside him like a storm. "I'm trying to learn more about my family, about my uncle." The woman's expression shifted, a shadow crossing her features at the mention of his uncle. "Henry's such a tragic story. You must know what happened to him." Alexander nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words. "I've heard fragments, something about a child." The woman's eyes grew distant, as though she were gazing into a past long buried beneath years of silence. "Yes, a child. After the accident, everything changed. People didn't speak much about it, but it left scars on your family. There were whispers of secrets and broken ties." His heart pounded as he absorbed her words. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but the picture remained incomplete. "Do you know what happened to that child? Do you know where I can find him?" She hesitated, her eyes clouded with memories. "There are some things better left buried, dear. But if you're searching for your family, maybe you'll find what you're looking for." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Alexander standing alone in the house that had once felt so familiar, but now seemed strange and distant. As he stood there, surrounded by the echoes of the past, he realized that his journey to uncover his family's story had only just begun. An overwhelming sense of purpose washed over him as he resolved to piece together the fragments of his life that had been scattered for far too long. Wandering through the quiet, aged streets of his childhood neighborhood, Alexander felt a near-tangible pull, as if the very air was thick with nostalgia and untold stories. The houses stood like silent sentinels, each one harboring memories, some cherished, others painful. He paused, his gaze fixing on a small, white cottage with a picket fence that had clearly seen better days. The paint was peeling, and the garden was overrun with weeds, yet there was an undeniable warmth to the house, a reminder of simpler times. His mind raced with thoughts of Oliver and the deep connection he had felt when the boy mentioned the birthmark. It was as though a door had been opened to a world he had long forgotten, and the weight of family secrets pressed heavily on his shoulders. He knew he had to seek the truth, no matter how painful it might be. As he continued down the street, an elderly woman tending her garden caught his attention. She had silver hair pulled back into a neat bun and a kind face that seemed to brighten when she noticed him. Alexander felt an instinctive urge to approach her, as though she might hold the missing pieces to the puzzle he was desperately trying to assemble. "Excuse me, ma'am," he began, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "I'm looking for information about my family. I used to live around here when I was younger." The woman wiped her hands on her apron and stepped closer, squinting as she studied his face. "Alexander Grant, isn't it? My goodness, how you've grown. You were just a child when you left. Your parents, such good people." A spark of recognition ignited in Alexander's chest, and he nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Yes, that's right. Do you remember anything about my uncle? I've been told there were some tragic events that involved our family." The woman's expression darkened, her brow furrowing in thought. "Ah, yes, a tragedy, indeed. Your Uncle Henry. There was something about him, something that troubled him deeply. I can't say I know all the details, but I remember the rumors in the neighborhood. After the accident, well, they said he had a child." Alexander's heart quickened. The words hung in the air like a fragile thread, and he felt as though he was on the verge of uncovering a long-buried truth. "Do you know what happened to that child?" he asked, his voice filled with anticipation. The woman hesitated, glancing around as if to ensure no one else was listening. "The child was taken away after the accident. There were rumors about the mother. It was a dark time for your family. People didn't talk about it much. It was as if the whole town wanted to forget. Do you know where they went?" Alexander pressed, desperation creeping into his voice. "Is there any way I can learn more?" She shook her head, a look of regret in her eyes. "I'm afraid not, dear. It was all kept very quiet. But if you're looking for answers, you might want to talk to Daniel Harper. He was around during that time, and he might know more about what happened." "Daniel Harper," Alexander repeated, committing the name to memory. "Thank you for your help." As he turned to leave, the woman called after him, her voice gentle but firm. "Be careful, Alexander. Some truths are better left buried. Her words echoed in his mind as he made his way to Daniel's house. What had she meant by that? Would the truth bring him peace, or only deepen the chasm of sorrow that seemed to define his family's history? A knot formed in his stomach with each step, uncertainty gnawing at his resolve. When he arrived at the modest home, he paused at the door for a moment, taking in the surroundings. The lawn was well kept, and a swing swayed gently in the breeze, a nostalgic reminder of childhood innocence. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. A moment later, the door opened to reveal a man in his early 40s. He had a warm smile, but it faded when he noticed the serious expression on Alexander's face. "Can I help you?" the man asked. "Hello, I'm Alexander Grant," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "I was hoping to speak with you about my family." Daniel raised an eyebrow, confusion flickering across his face as he shook Alexander's hand. "Grant, I didn't know you were around here. What brings you by?" "Recently, I discovered some things about my family, and it seems we might have some connections," Alexander explained, feeling the weight of his words. "I've heard you might know more about my uncle and the events surrounding his life." Daniel's expression shifted, a shadow crossing his face. "Ah, I see. It's a complicated story, one that many would rather forget. Come in, we can talk." As Alexander stepped inside, he was struck by the warmth of the place. Family photos lined the walls, laughter captured in frozen frames. Yet despite the joy in the pictures, an undercurrent of unease lingered in the air, as if the happiness depicted was merely a facade. The images from Alexander's mind felt bittersweet, a stark contrast against the backdrop of his search for the truth. He sat at the kitchen table, his pulse racing as Daniel took the seat across from him. "Tell me, what do you know?" Daniel asked, his voice firm but tinged with caution. Alexander recounted his encounter with Oliver, the mention of the shared birthmark, and the revelations from the elderly woman about their intertwined past. Every word felt heavy, as though he was laying the foundation of a bridge that spanned across generations. "I've been searching for answers," Alexander concluded, his gaze locked on Daniel's. "I need to understand what happened to my uncle and that child. I can't shake the feeling that there's more to this story." Daniel let out a long sigh, rubbing the back of his neck as he leaned back in his chair. "It's not an easy story to tell, Alexander. Your uncle was a good man, but he struggled with demons that most people never saw. The accident had changed everything. The child, my brother, he was taken from us too soon." "Your brother?" Alexander's mind raced. "You mean?" "Yes," Daniel confirmed, his expression pained. "My brother was your uncle's son. We were told he died after the accident. But there were rumors, whispers that he might still be alive, taken for reasons we never fully understood." "Do you know where he went? Is there any chance he's still alive?" Alexander's heart pounded at the possibilities. Daniel shook his head, anguish evident in his eyes. "I wish I could tell you more. All I know is that after the tragedy, our family fell apart. We lost contact, and the truth was wrapped in silence, as though no one wanted to acknowledge what had happened. The silence between them grew thick, both men lost in their thoughts. Alexander felt a surge of emotions. Grief for the family he never knew, anger at the secrets that kept them apart, and a glimmer of hope that he might be able to mend the broken threads of their shared history. "Can you help me find more answers?" Alexander finally asked, breaking the quiet. "I need to know where to start." Daniel met his gaze, a flicker of determination lighting in his eyes. "If you're willing to dig deep, I'll help you. We can try to piece together the fragmented parts of our family's story." "Thank you," Alexander murmured, feeling a renewed sense of purpose wash over him. This was no longer just a search for answers. It was a journey to reclaim his identity, to understand who he really was. He had spent so much of his life building walls around his heart, but now he felt a bridge beginning to form, one that could connect him to the family he had lost. As they began discussing the next steps, a new bond began to take root between them. Two men united by blood and the shadows of their past. The path ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, Alexander felt the stirrings of hope, a whisper of redemption that called him forward. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air of the small cafe where Alexander Grant had arranged to meet Daniel. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting a warm glow over the rustic wooden tables and mismatched chairs. Alexander arrived a few minutes early, his heart pounding with anticipation. He had meticulously planned this meeting, but the reality of it all felt far more overwhelming than he had imagined. As he sat at a small table near the window, he couldn't stop replaying the events of the past few days in his mind. The charity gala had seemed like just another event on his busy agenda, but Oliver's innocent remark had sparked an insatiable curiosity within him. Now, he was on the verge of uncovering a truth that could change everything about his past, his identity, and his family. Daniel arrived punctually, his demeanor a mix of curiosity and unease. He glanced around the cafe before his gaze settled on Alexander, who stood to greet him. "You must be Alexander," Daniel said, extending his hand, his voice steady despite the tension hanging in the air. "Yes, and you must be Daniel," Alexander responded, shaking his hand firmly. There was a brief moment of palpable connection, a flicker of something neither of them could fully explain. They sat down, the weight of unspoken words lingering between them. "Thank you for meeting with me," Alexander began, trying to steady his voice. "I know this is unusual, but I felt it was important to talk." Daniel nodded, his brow furrowing as he considered the situation. "I've been thinking about this too. Oliver mentioned you. Well, it's all very strange." Alexander leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What did Oliver say?" "He said you looked like him. At first, I thought it was just a child's imagination, but..." Daniel's voice trailed off, and he looked away, momentarily lost in thought. "It's been a long time since anyone has mentioned family. We've kept our lives private for so long." "I understand," Alexander replied, his heart racing. "I've been trying to piece together my family story. There are so many gaps. It's like I've been living in a fog." Daniel met his gaze again, and for a moment, it felt like they were two ships passing in the night, both searching for something lost. "What do you know about your family?" Daniel asked cautiously. Alexander hesitated, the memories rising to the surface. "My childhood was complicated. I grew up with some relatives, but I always felt like something was missing. There was a name that kept coming up, an uncle who disappeared when I was young. My parents never talked about him. It was like he never existed." Daniel's expression darkened, as though the weight of Alexander's words brought back memories of his own. He sighed deeply, his face etched with a mix of sadness and resignation. "Your uncle was a complicated man. He dealt with things that others couldn't understand. And then, after the accident, everything fell apart. My brother, his son, was taken from us, and we were told he died, but there were always rumors, whispers that he was still out there alive but hidden away." Alexander's heart skipped a beat. The pieces of his past were starting to come together, but the picture was still unclear. A flash of recognition lit up Daniel's eyes. "You might know more than you think," he said softly. "That uncle, he was my father." The words hung in the air, laden with significance. Alexander felt the breath catch in his throat. "Your father? But how is that possible? I thought he disappeared." "He never truly disappeared. Not in the way people think," Daniel replied. "He had a family, my mother and me. But after the accident, everything changed. We were separated. I grew up hearing stories about him, but it was never clear why he left." "What accident?" Alexander asked, his heart racing as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, though the picture was still blurred. Daniel took a deep breath, the memories clearly painful. "It was a car accident. My mother was driving, and my father didn't survive. I was just a baby, too young to remember. After that, my mother struggled to keep everything together. We moved away, and it felt like we were trying to escape the shadows of the past." Alexander's mind raced. "Why didn't I know about you? Why didn't anyone tell me?" "I think it hurt too much," Daniel replied, his voice laced with sadness. "Families can be complicated, full of secrets. My mother never wanted to talk about it. It was easier to pretend like it hadn't happened." They both fell silent, each lost in their thoughts. Alexander was overcome with a surge of emotions: anger, confusion, and a deep sadness for the family he had never known. "Oliver has the same birthmark as me," Alexander said, the realization dawning on him. All this time, I thought it was just a coincidence. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. The birthmark, it's a family trait, something that's been passed down for generations. I always thought it was just a genetic quirk. Then it's possible we're connected, Alexander whispered, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. You and I, we could be family. Just as their conversation was reaching a crucial point, Daniel's phone vibrated on the table, interrupting the moment. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting to one of concern. I'm sorry, he said, standing reluctantly. I have to take this. Of course, Alexander replied, trying to mask his disappointment. As Daniel stepped away, Alexander felt the sudden emptiness of the cafe envelop him. He stared at the half-empty coffee cups, the remnants of their conversation lingering heavily in the air. He wrestled with a whirlwind of thoughts. Was this the moment he had been waiting for? The answer seemed just within reach, but Daniel's abrupt departure left him feeling more lost than ever. Alexander pulled out his own phone, debating whether he should call the investigator for more information. But something inside him told him to stay in the moment, to sit with the uncertainty that now surrounded him and the new possibilities it brought. His eyes drifted to the small notebook that Daniel had left on the table. It was a discreet, worn object, but it seemed charged with significance. He picked it up, flipping through its pages filled with sketches and notes. It appeared to be a family tree, and as his fingers traced the lines, a sense of urgency welled up inside him. He could almost feel the threads of his life weaving together with Daniel's, the invisible bonds of family tightening in that moment. Just then, Daniel returned, his expression apologetic. Sorry about that. Family matters, he said, sitting down again. Now, where were we? Alexander hesitated, looking down at the notebook in his hands. I found this. It looks like it details your family history. Our family history. Daniel's eyes widened, a mixture of intrigue and concern crossing his face. Let me see. As they leaned in together over the notebook, a deep sense of connection began to form. They were no longer just two men brought together by chance. They were kindred spirits, bound by blood and a shared history. Alexander felt a flicker of hope ignite within him, a longing to uncover the truth and perhaps forge a bond that had been lost long ago. Do you think, Alexander began, his voice barely above a whisper, that we could become a family again? Daniel looked at him, his expression softening. I'd like that. I think Oliver would too. He's always wanted to know more about where he comes from. The weight of the moment hung in the air, and in that small cafe, between the clinking of cups and the quiet murmur of other patrons, two paths crossed. They were stepping into uncharted territory, ready to explore the possibilities of a shared future, one that promised to heal old wounds and fill the gaps of their intertwined pasts. As Alexander sat in the quiet cafe, the remnants of his conversation with Daniel lingered heavily in the air. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the sweet aroma of pastries, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the small notebook Daniel had left on the table, its cover slightly worn with time. The notebook seemed to pulse with significance, a tangible link to the truth he had been searching for. Alexander's mind raced with the possibilities of what lay ahead. A surge of adrenaline shot through Alexander as his hand reached for the notebook, the object now promising the answers he'd been chasing for so long. As he opened it, a rush of emotion hit him. The pages were filled with sketches, names, and intricate lines connecting them like a web of secrets waiting to be unraveled. The first few pages detailed what appeared to be a family tree. His heart pounded as he traced the lines with his finger, moving from one name to the next. His breath caught in his throat when he recognized one of the names. His uncle, the mysterious figure from his childhood. It can't be, he whispered to himself, flipping through the pages with growing urgency. There were notes in the margins, scattered thoughts about family gatherings, lost connections, and a tragic accident that had torn their families apart. Then, as he turned another page, his eyes widened in disbelief. A sketch of a child, with a distinctive birthmark on his arm, stared back at him. The resemblance to Oliver was uncanny. Just then, Daniel returned, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. Sorry about that, he said, slipping back into his seat. Urgent call from work. Alexander felt his pulse quicken, the weight of what he'd just uncovered pressing on his chest. He hesitated, unsure of how to begin, how to reveal the truth that had just dawned on him. It was almost too much to grasp. "Daniel," Alexander finally said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I found your notebook." Daniel frowned, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "It details a family tree," Alexander replied, his hands trembling as he pointed to the pages. "It connects us, Daniel. You're not just someone who resembles me, you're family." Daniel leaned forward, his expression shifting from confusion to intrigue. "What are you talking about?" "Your father," Alexander continued, his voice now a whisper, "is my uncle. That makes you my cousin." The words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Daniel's eyes widened in shock as he leaned back in his chair, processing what Alexander had just revealed. "That can't be," Daniel muttered, shaking his head. "I mean, I've heard stories about my father's family, but I never thought." "Your father and my uncle drifted apart after a family tragedy," Alexander interrupted, his heart aching at the thought of the past that had kept them separated for so long. "I had no idea, not until this moment." A long silence fell between them, broken only by the distant clinking of cups and the quiet murmur of other cafe patrons. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, visibly shaken. "This is a lot to take in." "I know," Alexander said, his voice softer now, full of understanding. "I've spent years searching for answers about my family. When I met Oliver and learned about the birthmark, it was like a spark ignited inside me." Daniel's eyes gleamed with recognition. "Oliver always said he felt some kind of connection with you. It was strange, but he couldn't explain it." "Because it's real," Alexander said, leaning in, urgency creeping into his voice. "We're connected by blood, by history. That birthmark, it's a symbol of that connection." Daniel's gaze drifted toward the window, lost in thought. "My father used to talk about a family he lost contact with," he said quietly. "He mentioned a tragedy that separated them, but he never gave details. It was always a mystery to us." "I think I can help fill in those gaps," Alexander offered, feeling a surge of determination. "We can uncover the truth together, Daniel. For Oliver's sake and for ours." Daniel looked at him again, a flicker of hope sparking in his eyes. "You really want to do this?" "Absolutely," Alexander affirmed, his heart swelling with the possibility of mending the broken family ties. "I want to understand what happened and find a way to heal these old wounds." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow through the cafe windows, the two men began to talk more freely. They shared stories of their lives, their struggles, their dreams. Alexander found himself captivated by Daniel's resilience, the way he had navigated his own challenges while carrying the weight of a family he barely knew. "You know," Daniel said, his voice filled with conviction, "my father always said that family is everything. It's what keeps us grounded, even when we feel lost." Alexander nodded, feeling a shift growing between them. "I've spent so much time building my empire, but now I realize I've neglected what really matters. Family, connection, legacy. I want to change that." "Then let's change it," Daniel said, a smile breaking through the tension. "Let's start by bringing our families together, beginning with Oliver. He deserves to know the truth about where he comes from." "Absolutely," Alexander agreed, a sense of purpose igniting within him. "Let's make sure he knows he's part of a larger story, one filled with love and resilience." As they made plans to meet again, a feeling of excitement filled the air, eclipsing the uncertainty that had once weighed so heavily on their pasts. The cafe, which had once been just the backdrop to their meeting, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where two lost souls had found their way back to each other. Later, as Alexander stepped out into the cool night air, he felt a profound shift inside himself. The shadows of his past were beginning to retreat, replaced by the warmth of new connections. He could already imagine the day when he would embrace Oliver, the boy who had unknowingly led him on this journey of discovery. For the first time in years, Alexander felt hope blooming within him. The threads of his life were weaving together in unexpected ways, and he was ready to embrace whatever came next. Family, he realized, wasn't just a word. It was a bond that could transcend time and distance, a legacy worth fighting for. As he walked toward his car, a smile played at the corners of his lips. He was no longer just Alexander Grant, the powerful billionaire. He was Alexander, a man on the verge of rediscovering his roots, ready to forge a path toward a brighter future, filled with love, connection, and the promise of family. If you like this story, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Until the next one,